Social Security and other federal benefits, people like Wigforce. She receives a small Social Security payment from having worked in California for several years, and she believes that's why the IRS erroneously sent her a stimulus check.
I'm not going to cash it. I'm just going to leave it here. There's no way I'm going to cash this money. It doesn't belong to me.
Since Congress passed its coronavirus relief package in March, the U.S. government has put no mechanisms in place to prevent these mistakes from happening again. That means if a new relief plan passes in the final weeks of the Trump administration or during the Biden administration, and if it includes more stimulus payments, some of that money is again likely to mistakenly end up in mailboxes overseas. Wigforce is even likely to get another check.
How much money is bleeding out from the Treasury Department because of these stimulus checks? I wonder.
The U.S. government cannot answer that question. The Treasury did find that as of late May, $34 million in stimulus had gone to people who filed a tax return with a foreign address. But that includes eligible people, like U.S. citizens living abroad, and it does not include citizens of other countries who received a check at a U.S. address. For example, NPR interviewed a citizen of the Dominican Republic who was not eligible, yet got a check at his former address in Massachusetts. That $34 million also does not include people like Wigforce who got a check but don't file a U.S. tax return at all.
I think the poor folks in the IRS don't have the bandwidth to go chasing this.
Enda Kelleher is a vice president at Sprint Tax, which does U.S. tax preparation for non-residents.
It'd be great if they did, because I believe that there's millions of dollars that has gone to people that weren't entitled to it, or that certainly not the intended recipients.
Sprint Tax has clients from about 150 countries who mistakenly receive stimulus checks. Kelleher said the most common were India, China, South Korea, Vietnam, and the United Kingdom, as well as numerous nations in Latin America.
It's awful when we hear millions of dollars going into the wrong hands, but it was probably within a somewhat acceptable threshold of error or margin of error.
Acceptable, he said, because Congress opted for speed over accuracy when it flooded the U.S. economy with money last spring. Many non-Americans who received a check in error are now trying to return it because they worry it will jeopardize their visa or immigration status.
But there's equally thousands that are saying, well, if they were silly enough to make this mistake, it's their mistake and I'm not going to give it back until they ask for it.
Van Shockley falls in that category. He's 74 years old and was born in Pennsylvania. But he moved to Australia after becoming disillusioned with U.S. politics in the 1960s.
I had always been depressed when JFK was killed. I just couldn't get over that. So I started looking for someplace else, start all over.
So he gave up his U.S. citizenship and has now been an Australian citizen for about a half century. His last trip to the U.S. was 40 years ago. But he too received stimulus money, even though he's not eligible for it and does not file a U.S. tax return.
That was the weirdest thing ever. I checked the mail and I pulled out a check. Federal Reserve Treasury thingamajig over the Eagle and that. It's made out to me. This is from America. What the hell's going on here? Why am I getting a check from the government?
Just like Suzanne Wigforce in Sweden, Van Shockley in Australia suspects he mistakenly got a check because he received Social Security from having worked in the U.S. before moving overseas.
First I thought it was a joke, and then I went down to the bank and I said, can you do some way of verifying that this is legal? And the girl come back after 5 minutes and says, it's legal, you got the money. Thank you, man. I didn't ask for the money. I didn't expect any money. But as soon as I got it, I stuck it in the bank. He ain't getting it back.
Shockley attributes the mistake to U.S. government incompetence.
Complete stupidity. They're just not doing their job properly.
U.S. Treasury officials said they are, quote, continuing to assess the accuracy of the stimulus program and the recovery efforts for any erroneous payments.
Sasha Pfeiffer on Morning Edition from NPR News.
This is Morning Edition on WNYC. I'm David First. Coming up, speaking on ABC yesterday, Dr. Anthony Fauci stressed the need for Americans to do more to slow down the pandemic.
Let's try to mitigate the things that push the kind of community spread that we're trying to avoid.
A look at the scope of the crisis President-elect Biden will soon inherit and what he can do to play catch-up coming up later this hour.
WNYC WNYC supporters include Basis Independent Manhattan, a pre-K through grade 12 private school where curious students explore STEM, humanities, the arts, and more. Virtual open house on December 12th. BasisIndependent.com/WNYC. Netflix, presenting Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, directed by George C. Wolfe and starring Chadwick Boseman and Viola Davis as the legendary Ma Rainey. Now playing in select theaters and on Netflix December 18th, rated R.
Tomorrow is Giving Tuesday, the global day dedicated to giving back. And for 1 hour only, you'll have the special opportunity to maximize your contribution to WNYC during a 1 hour dollar for dollar match. Tune in to the Giving Tuesday Power Hour tomorrow at 8 a.m. If you won't be near the radio tomorrow morning at 8, contribute right now. Call 888-376-WNYC or go to WNYC.org and click on Donate.
Degrees now, rainy and breezy today. The rain could be heavy at times, warm as well, getting up to a high of 64 degrees. Tonight, showers likely, then mostly cloudy with a low around 50 degrees. Tomorrow, partly sunny, a chance of showers, the temperature dropping into the 40s during the day.
Support for NPR comes from WNYC members and from Amazon Studios with a new film, Sound of Metal. Riz Ahmed plays a drummer confronting his new world of silence after he abruptly loses his hearing. Also starring Olivia Cook, starts Friday on Prime Video. Avast, a cybersecurity company serving more than 435 million users, dedicated to delivering 3D online protection for privacy, security, and performance at Avast.com. And the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Medicare open enrollment is now through December 7th. 2021 plans and information at medicare.gov or 1-800-MEDICARE.
This is Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Rachel Martin.
And I'm Lulu Garcia Navarro. The census counts every person in the United States every 10 years, regardless of their immigration status. The Trump administration is trying to change that. Today, it will argue before the Supreme Court that undocumented immigrants should not be included in the count, and that could impact how new congressional districts are drawn in 2021. Here is NPR legal affairs correspondent Ina Toten.
The United States was the first country to put a mandatory national population count into its constitution. The plan was to count every person living in the newly created United States of America and to use that count to allocate how many votes each state would get in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. Margot Anderson, perhaps the leading census historian, says the census was to be a reflection of we the people in the preamble to the Constitution.
So then the question comes, okay, how do we measure the people? Should we do voters? Should we do property owners? Should we do this? Should we do that? And they decided, look, just let's count everybody and be done with it.
The Constitution's so-called Great Compromise was that every state would get 2 senators, no matter what the state's population, and the House of Representatives and Electoral College would be apportioned to represent, quote, the whole number of persons counted in the census of each state. There were only 2 exceptions. Native Americans living on tribal lands were deemed to be part of a different sovereign nation, and the enslaved population in the South was counted, but for only 3/5 of their number. That changed after the Civil War when the 14th Amendment counted the former slaves as whole persons too. Indeed, as census historian Anderson observes, no census has ever been conducted that did not aim to count everyone on U.S. soil regardless of immigration status. Until now. In July, President Trump issued a memorandum ordering the Census Bureau to send him 2 sets of numbers. One set was for the whole number of persons in each state, and the second set for apportionment of the number of congressional seats in each state and the Electoral College was to subtract the number of undocumented immigrants from the total population numbers. As the memorandum candidly admitted, that might mean that California, for instance, would lose 2 congressional seats.
That's illegal because the Constitution and federal statutes require the House to be divvied up according to the census. Now they say they're changing the census itself.
That's Dale Ho of the ACLU, who represents a coalition of immigrant rights groups. They and 22 states, led by New York, are challenging the president's order.
The decision that the founders made that the framers of the 14th Amendment made was that states get representation in Congress based on the number of people that they are responsible for and have to represent. And it doesn't matter whether those people are voters or not, if they're citizens or not, or what their immigration status is or not.
And he adds that one reason for linking apportionment to the census was to set an objective standard and prevent political manipulation. The Trump administration, however, contends that under the federal law governing the census, the president has, quote, unfettered discretion as to what data will be used when it comes to who counts for purposes of apportionment. Interestingly, the usual red state coalition that in other cases has supported the administration in the Supreme Court is not present in this case. Texas, Florida, Arizona, and other Republican-dominated states are missing in action in this case because they might well lose seats if Trump prevails. So far, the president has lost his argument in 3 lower courts, with both Democratic and Republican-appointed judges ruling against him unanimously. Just 10 states, accounting for a mere 52 congressional seats and electoral college votes, are siding with the administration. Among them is Alabama, which would likely lose a seat if the usual procedures in the census are followed. Alabama Solicitor General Edmund LaCour echoes the themes in the Trump administration's argument. He maintains that the Constitution's mandate to count a whole number of persons for the census actually meant inhabitants, and he argues that the Founding Fathers would have viewed inhabitants as people who have permission from the sovereign to be here and who have publicly stated they intend to remain here.
Our argument is that illegal aliens do not meet either of those requirements. They are here not by permission of the federal government, therefore they are not inhabitants as framers would have understood it when deciding how to divide federal power among the states.
Countering that argument, Dale Ho notes that more than 60% of undocumented immigrants have lived in this country for at least 10 years, with the median being 15 years. And he points to the statute enacted in 1929 after a gridlocked Congress failed to agree on how to proceed. The 1929 law created an automatic reapportionment system based on the census, under which the president is to report total population numbers for each state to Congress for certification. And that's where this case runs into some extra wrinkles. Because of the pandemic, the Census Bureau has already indicated it likely will not be able to meet the usual December 31st deadline for reporting its figures. Nor has the Bureau been able to ascertain what portion of those people living in the United States are not here legally. President Trump, by law, has just 10 days to carry out his ministerial duty to convey to Congress how many congressional seats each state is supposed to get. So Trump may not be able to send reliable figures to the House for certification by the time he leaves office. And if he does send figures that do not include all residents counted by the census, the clerk of the House may well refuse to certify those figures, kicking the census back to the new Biden administration to complete for reapportionment. Nina Totenberg, NPR News, Washington.
On tomorrow's Morning Edition, 6 years after ISIS embarked on genocide in the Yazidi homeland, how some Yazidis are returning home only to find their villages ruined. Listen by asking your smart speaker to play NPR or your member station by name. This is NPR News.
And this is Morning Edition on WNYC. Coming up, a proposed security measure that would restrict the filming of police officers led to large protests in France over the weekend. We'll hear more about that coming up later this hour. 51 degrees now in Central Park. It's 6:30.
Support for WNYC comes from the virtual Other Israel Film Festival, presented by the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan, an in-depth look into Israeli and Palestinian societies through films and conversations, December 3rd through 10th. More at otherisrael.org. The New York Community Trust. Listeners can leave charitable bequests to the New York Community Trust that are built to have a lasting impact. More information at give2.nyc.
If you believe democracy requires a free press, your station is WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820, NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Dave Mattingly. President-elect Joe Biden is expected to receive his first presidential daily briefing today, nearly 4 weeks after Election Day 2020. In a statement, Biden's office says afterwards the president-elect will meet with his advisors. Over the weekend, Biden fractured his right foot while playing with one of his dogs. Biden is 78 years old and the oldest person elected president of the U.S. He's expected to wear a walking boot for several weeks. In-person classes will resume for some students in New York City's public school system a week from today. NPR's Anya Kamenetz reports on the mayor's announcement.
New York City public schools will be reopening in phases, starting on Monday, December 7th.
That's Mayor Bill de Blasio at a Sunday news conference. Preschool and elementary school students, he said, will be followed by students with significant disabilities. Fewer than a third of the district's more than 1 million students, those who previously opted into in-person, are eligible. There is no plan yet for older students. New York City's public schools originally closed on November 19th after the city hit a 3% average positivity rate on coronavirus tests. As of this Sunday, the citywide rate was 3.9%. Anya Kamenetz, NPR News, New York.
New York City is the nation's largest public school system. This is NPR News from Washington.
And this is WNYC in New York at 6:32. Good morning, I'm David First. 51 degrees now. It's going to be rainy and breezy today with a high near 65 degrees. New York City Public Schools plan to welcome students back into classrooms next Monday, but only pre-K through 5th graders who have already opted into the city's blended learning model. Nearly 2/3 of the city's students will continue to learn remotely for now. That concerns the City Council's Education Committee Chair, Mark Traeger.
This proposal does not include all of our children with IEPs or our children in temporary housing. It does not include all of our English language learners.
Traeger says the de Blasio administration needs to improve the remote learning experience for these students, many of whom still don't have devices or internet access. Students with disabilities in District 75 can return starting December 10th. And Mayor de Blasio says he's working on a plan for middle and high school students to return soon. We'll hear more about school reopenings coming up next. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy says he's feeling confident about the development and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics. But speaking on Fox News yesterday, he said much more needs to happen before President-elect Biden takes office in January.
The more the president-elect and the president are speaking from the same playbook, the more confidence folks will have in taking that vaccine.
Murphy says his biggest fear in the coming weeks is people without symptoms spreading the virus at indoor private gatherings to older and more vulnerable people. He says New Jerseyans must resist COVID fatigue and avoid those gatherings this holiday season. The weekend after Thanksgiving is typically a boon for small business owners, but because of the pandemic this year, brought a lull unlike many can remember.
2019 at this time, we were full booked for the weekend.
Bibi Bardun owns a cleaning company in Plainfield, New Jersey. Her clients include Buffalo Wild Wings and office buildings, and about 15% of her business is in Newark, where COVID is soaring. So far this year, she has only a handful of jobs.
2 office buildings and an American Legion.
Bardun says she's surviving by reaching into her savings. 51 degrees now, partly cloudy. It will be rainy, breezy today, possibly a thunderstorm as well, and the rain could be heavy at times. And yes, warm, high right in the mid-60s today. Tonight, showers likely, then mostly cloudy overnight with a low around 50 degrees.
Support for NPR comes from member stations and from C3. C3.ai software enables organizations to use artificial intelligence at enterprise scale, solving previously unsolvable business problems. Learn more at c3.ai. And Total Wine & More, where in-store teams can recommend a bottle of wine, spirit, or beer for the holidays. Shoppers can explore more than 8,000 wines, 2,500 beers, and 3,000 spirits. More at TotalWine.com.
It's Morning Edition on WNYC. I'm David First. New York City Public Schools plan to welcome some students back into classrooms next Monday. Mayor de Blasio says the option will be available for 3K through 5th graders who have already opted into the city's blended learning model. But that move excludes nearly 2/3 of the city's students who have already opted out. Here to talk us through all of this is WNYC's planning editor, Kate Hines. Good morning, Kate.
Good morning, David.
So first of all, Mayor de Blasio had really been sticking to his earlier decision to close down schools if the citywide positivity rate reached 3%. It did. He went ahead and did it. And even though he faced some pretty vocal criticism over that, what seems to have brought about this new change of heart?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of whiplash happening in the schools policy, but I'm going to guess it was the ferocious pushback he got from many parents and local elected officials who pointed out that it was inconsistent to keep children from learning in person at the same time bars and restaurants are allowed to operate, albeit at lower capacity. And that 3% benchmark was something that had been set in the summer, months ago. And of course, science is changing and evolving all the time. And it seemed, to some people inconsistent to stick to something that was a low number set, way back in the early, what was then an earlier time in the pandemic. Also, even though coronavirus cases are increasing right now and New York City's positivity rate is 3.9%, that number's been lower in schools. Before the mayor shut down all in-person learning 12 days ago, 0.28% of the school-based tests were positive. So there is consensus, at least right now, that transmission is less of an issue in schools than in other settings.
Okay, so help us understand all of this, though. Not all kids are going to be able to go back to schools. The decision comes with a lot of asterisks. Who gets to go back?
Right. So buildings will open on Thursday, December 10th for students in all grades of what's known as District 75. These are the students with the most significant disabilities. 1 week from today, December 7th, schools serving pre-K students and students in kindergarten through 5th grade will reopen to families who had already chosen to be in hybrid learning, blended learning. In other words, if you had already picked an all-remote program, you are still all remote. If you are hybrid, you're moving to a more in-person experience, but schools have to determine if they have the space to do increased in-person learning. Spacing protocols still apply. So it may be that schools that already had high numbers of kids opting into hybrid learning won't be able to expand in-person capacity hugely. So we'll be watching that closely. It's the schools who had just small numbers of students showing up for in-person learning 1 to 3 days a week who might be able to expand in-person learning, again, for those students who had already signed up for it. So this turns out to be roughly about 190,000 students, all told, that this will affect. That's still a fraction of the 1.1 million public school students in New York City. Who's not returning to school yet? Middle and high school students. There's still no plan yet to return them to in-person learning, and the mayor said they'll be working on that in the days and weeks to come.
Okay, a lot of unknowns here. How is this going to work? Will elementary kids be using buildings and staff previously assigned to older students?
Great question. I don't know the answer to that. Space and available teaching as teachers is going to be a huge consideration. 20% of students and staff will need to be tested each week, and the mayor keeps hammering home how important it is to fill out the consent form and that you will not be allowed to return to a school building without that consent form. There are still protocols to close classrooms or schools in the event of positive cases. And of course, we have to take into consideration Governor Cuomo's zone protocols. So schools in red or orange zones will have different requirements. And there's still an orange zone in Staten Island right now, although schools can test out of that.
And what about the bars and gyms that have stayed open? This is something a lot of people ask about. Are there any plans to rethink those staying open in the face of the recent increase in COVID cases?
Right. Well, unlike schools, which are, seem to be more or less under the control of localities, only Governor Cuomo can determine if bars and restaurants and gyms have to shut down. So that's something that we'll be watching closely.
Okay, a lot to watch there. WNYC's planning editor, Kate Hines. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.
It's Morning Edition Edition from NPR News, I'm Lulu Garcia Navarro.
And I'm Rachel Martin. The United States has continued to set unwelcome records this fall. The country is seeing more than 150,000 new cases of the coronavirus every day. And we got to a point last week where one person was dying every minute. Just think about that for a moment. One person every single minute. The CDC urged Americans not to travel for Thanksgiving, but the fact is airports saw their highest foot traffic since the middle of March. Here's how Dr. Anthony Fauci summarized the situation on ABC's This Week over the weekend.
We may see a surge upon a surge. We don't want to frighten people, but that's just the reality. We said that these things would happen as we got into the cold weather and as we began traveling, and they've happened. It's going to happen again.
This moment has got John Micklethwaite thinking, how did we get here and what to do now? He's the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg, and his new book, co-authored with the economist Adrian Wooldridge, is titled The Wake-Up Call, Why the Pandemic Has Exposed the Weakness of the West and How to Fix It. Thanks for being here, John.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
You argue that the pandemic has revealed in painful detail that the U.S. is falling behind much of the world in most functions of government. What's your evidence?
Well, the main evidence of the disease is really simple. It's very sadly, America is now around 800 deaths for every million people. And if you compare that with other places, like Germany is 6 times better. It's around 150 deaths for every million people.
Mm-hmm.
But you really, when you go to East Asia, you find these countries like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, they're all around 20 or 30 deaths for every million people. So they're about 20 or 30 times better. And what's interesting to me is that doesn't seem like a fluke once you begin to look at things like league tables for education or for healthcare. And it looks much broader than that. So that's one element in which we're facing a wake-up call. The second thing for America is China. China claims a number of 3 deaths for every million people. And maybe they're exaggerating, maybe they're hiding deaths. But even if they're hiding 9 out of 10 deaths, and Bloomberg probably has more journalists than anybody else in China, and we don't think it's that level. But imagine they're up around 30 deaths for every million people. That would still be 20, 30 times better than America. And so I think it really is one of those things where you look at it and you wonder whether history is being changed. And the message to America is we've got to do something about this because it's part of a wider problem with government in America.
So let's pick at that a little bit. I mean, you point to just the facts are the facts about the pandemic and how horrible it has been in this country. And you tick off failures in healthcare, education. Can you make that connection for me? What does it reveal about the fragility of the entire American system?
Well, I think there's a lot of things at the moment where, particularly if you're Joe Biden, there is the kind of false excuse, I think, of blaming Donald Trump. I'm not trying to claim Donald Trump handled the pandemic particularly well. But if you look at the evidence, a healthcare system that is orientated towards looking after the old and the rich was bound, I think, to fail with a pandemic because it hits the poor disproportionately. You look at many of the other things that Donald Trump is blamed for, racist policing. I think I first appeared on NPR back when Rodney King was happening in Los Angeles and I was a correspondent there. That's been going on for a long time. The schools in America, if you look at the international league tables, America's around, depending on 17th in reading, I think it's about 38th in math. I mean, it's a long way behind. Those things have been going on for a long time, and behind it, I think there is a problem with government. And as you know, I came from The Economist. I'm one of those people who believes fervently in the free market. But the lesson of COVID is really simple, is that government matters. It was the difference between living and dying. And the numbers are, it's nothing to do with culture. It's simply to do with making things work. If you look at Seoul, London and New York, they're all about the same size. Seoul's a very busy modern city with all these many things. And yet New York's over 20,000 deaths. And Seoul's barely 50, 60 people have died.
Although these are such different societies, just in seconds remaining to briefly push back, I mean, South Korea is just an entirely different culture and society than the United States.
It is a different society, but Seoul is a very modern place. I mean, you've probably seen Parasite. It's got the world's biggest nightclubs.
Modernity doesn't really have anything to do with it, right? Like it's more. I mean, America is the largest pluralistic democratic experiment in the world, and
It is, but I don't think the things that you need to do to make government work fundamentally contradict that. I think that if you need to make schools better, you need to promote good teachers and be prepared to get rid of bad ones. If you look at the way that these Asian countries, what they've done is they've done exactly the same as America's private sector has done. They were much better. If you look at the private sector in America, when the Japanese came up with smaller, better cars, America copied it. Singapore has come up with smaller, better government. It hasn't copied it, and America hasn't copied it, and other Asian countries are copying it.
Lessons perhaps to be learned by looking abroad for the incoming Biden administration. John Micklethwaite of Bloomberg, thank you for your time.
You're listening to Morning Edition here on WNYC. 51 degrees right now, partly cloudy skies. It is going to be rainy and breezy today and quite warm, getting up to a high of 64 degrees. And the rain could be heavy at times.
Support for NPR comes from WNYC members and from Progressive Insurance, offering Snapshot, a program that adjusts insurance rates based on safe driving habits. Now that's Progressive. Learn more at progressive.com or 1-800-PROGRESSIVE. And Olive, an AI solution built for healthcare, dedicated to being all in and always on, so patients and healthcare workers get the care they need. Learn more at olivecares.com.
This is Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Rachel Martin.
And I'm Lulu Garcia Navarro. It is the blockbuster that has the literary world talking. The potential merger of the huge Simon & Schuster with Penguin Random House, the largest publishing company in the country. But the Authors Guild, the world's largest organization for writers, have released a statement opposing the deal. Laura Zatz is a literary agent and the host of the podcast Print Run, and she joins us now to explain why the joining of these two companies might be a cause for concern. Hi there.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
It is a pleasure to have you. By some accounts, this resulting super publisher, I think we could use that, could publish a third of all books in this country. Why do you feel that might be a problem?
Well, I think the big thing to understand is that it's not just that they're going to have so much of a market share, but what happens when a single company has a market share is that there's less competition for who can publish the books, which is really bad for agents, which is what I am, and really bad for writers.
How so?
As an agent, I submit to a lot of different imprints, a lot of different editors. And currently, for example, when Penguin and Random House merged in 2013, you could go to auction with those. You could submit and you could drive up advances and you could get better terms and for your writers.
So just so people understand this, basically you take a manuscript and you shop it around, and then if people want it, and a lot of people want it, then that drives up the price, and that means more money for you and more money for your writers.
Exactly. And nobody gets into writing for the money, and this is the only way that you can make it livable. And currently, what I'm really worried about is that now with Penguin Random House, if it's merging with Simon & Schuster, that brings the number of large publishers down to 4, and it means that there's just going to be less competition and there's going to be fewer opportunities for writers, and those opportunities will have less favorable terms.
So as a reader, why should we care about this deal?
Well, I think, the big thing is that if you're a reader who really only reads 10 books a year, the really big
splashy stuff, the bestsellers.
The really big splashy stuff, I think you're not really going to notice a huge difference. But if you are, if reading is your main hobby, if you read across genre, if you read really deep into particular genres, what you're going to see is you're going to see imprints that are closing, because with a monopoly, there is consolidation. With a merger, there's consolidation. You're going to have maybe a slight decrease in the discoverable writers that you're hoping to find on a bookshelf, just because there's going to be fewer imprints, fewer editors, and then mid-list, which I love the most as a reader, is going to be shrinking.
So just briefly, this isn't happening in a vacuum. One word, Amazon. They are playing into this because they are so dominant, and book publishers have kind of gathered together to sort of combat them. What do you think should happen? 10 seconds.
Oh man, that's a big question. Well, the big to understand about book publishing is that it is constantly operating in this push and pull between art and business. Amazon represents the side of book publishing that is 100% business, doesn't care about art in the same way that a lot of other publishers do. And I think with this merger,
We're gonna have to leave it there. So sorry. Lauren Zatz is a literary agent. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
The Marketplace Morning Report is coming up next here on WNYC. And later on Morning Edition, Fox News reached all-time viewership highs this year. But its recent acknowledgement that Joe Biden won the presidential election is giving its farther-right rivals a chance to move in. We'll have more on that coming up next hour. 51 degrees now. We're going up to 64 today. It will be rainy and breezy. The rain could be heavy at times today, possibly a thunderstorm as well. Tonight, a low around 50 degrees, and then tomorrow, partly sunny, a chance of showers. Temperature dropping into the 40s.
WNYC is supported by Columbia University, offering an opportunity for high school students to learn from Columbia faculty this spring. Application deadline December 14th. More info at precollege.sps.columbia.edu/highschool.
In a chaotic year for the U.S. Census with shifting deadlines and concerns about undercounting, census workers have been speaking out about what they saw on the ground in the final weeks of their work. Issues like faulty technology, duplicated efforts, and poor training have left many fearing an inaccurate 2020 count. I'm Tanzina Vega, and that's next time on The Takeaway, weekday afternoons at 3 on 93.9 FM.
The Biden economic team takes some shape, subject to confirmation.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by Progressive Insurance, offering its Home Quote Explorer so shoppers can evaluate options in one place when buying home insurance. Custom quotes and rates are available online. Learn more at progressive.com. And by C3.ai. C3.ai software enables organizations to use artificial intelligence at enterprise scale, solving previously unsolvable business problems. Learn more at C3.ai.
I'm David Brancaccio. Tomorrow, we're expecting Joe Biden to announce his picks for top-level economic positions in his administration. Names are leaking out, and Marketplace's Nova Safo has some of them.
Right, we're expecting Biden to nominate the first women of color to head the Office of Management and Budget and the Council of Economic Advisors. Both will need Senate confirmation. At the OMB, Biden is expected to nominate Neera Tanden, who is of South Asian descent, and Cecilia Rouse, who is Black, is expected to be nominated as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors.
Adding to the news last week that former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen has been tapped to be America's first woman to become Secretary of the Treasury. And where are some of the new names now?
Neera Tanden is currently the chief executive at the Center for American Progress. That's a prominent liberal-leaning think tank in Washington. She's considered one of the key architects of Obamacare. And Cecilia Rouse is a labor economist. She's the dean of the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton. She's been a strong proponent of more congressional spending to help blunt the economic effects of the pandemic.
And any early reaction to some of these potential nominees?
Right, well, Tanden has gotten some pushback. She's made a lot of public comments, specifically criticizing GOP senators. So some skepticism this morning from the right side of the aisle over whether she'll get the votes she needs to be confirmed.
Nova, thank you. Stock prices are moving with a published report today of a possible mega deal involving business data. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that the credit rating and market data outfit S&P Global wants to buy IHS Markit, a business data firm, for $44 billion. IHS stock is up about 6% pre-market trading now. Standard & Poor's was founded in 1860. Market with an I as its final vowel was started in 2003 to price credit default swaps, complex financial instruments that blew up in the great financial collapse of 2008. This morning, the S&P future, managed by a subsidiary of S&P Global, is down 0.4%. The Dow future is down 0.5%. The NASDAQ future up slightly, 5 points. Zoom, reports its quarterly results later today. The company's been on a roll, but a vaccine may not be good to Zoom. Marketplace's Mitchell Hartman has that.
Full disclosure, I did the interviews for this story on Zoom after a Marketplace news meeting on Zoom.
The entire world is sort of doing everything on Zoom, and I'm one of those verbs like Kleenex or Zamboni or Xerox.
Dan Romanoff covers technology at Morningstar, and he says at the start of the pandemic, as sheltering in place and working from home took hold, Zoom's video conferencing app took off. The company's sales and stock have soared. He says many companies plan to let their workers keep working remotely after the pandemic.
I don't think we're going to go back to everyone going to the office.
Still, Zoom could face headwinds once COVID restrictions on work and social life are eased, says Scott Kessler at Third Bridge.
How sustainable is the momentum as the world hopefully normalizes?
When good news on COVID vaccines drives drug company stocks up, it tends to drag stock in Zoom and other remote communication companies down. I'm Mitchell Hartman for Marketplace.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by the United States Postal Service, offering postage stamps for purchase at checkout at more than 40,000 participating supermarkets, drugstores, office suppliers, banks, and wholesale clubs. And by the Henry Luce Foundation, which seeks to increase American understanding of East and Southeast Asia. Learn more at hluce.org. And by WeWork, committed to working in new ways, focusing on health and safety, flexible terms with purposefully designed spaces. More at WeWork.com/tomorrow.
It's 51 days till the presidential inauguration. With COVID-19 raging, the Biden-Harris team has laid out an ambitious response to pandemic. Marketplace's Kimberly Adams has more from Washington on what it would take to put it into action.
Now that the Biden team has access to transition resources from the federal government, they're laying the groundwork for rolling out a variety of new initiatives to respond to the pandemic. Diane Heath, a professor of government and politics at St. John's University, says there's a lot Biden can do from day one.
Because so much of it is really about coordination and changing the communication and the messaging around the COVID response.
The Biden-Harris team has already started to work on the messaging part, with meetings and press conferences and panels with healthcare workers. Once in office, first on the agenda will likely be a series of executive orders.
On everything from interstate travel, how data can be reported and provided openly so that everyone can see it.
Tom Frieden is a physician and former director of the Center for Disease Control. He's now president of Resolve to Save Lives, a group focused on preventing epidemics. He says for smaller initiatives like setting up task forces and data coordination,
There are usually small amounts of money in different accounts that can be scraped up, as they said, and used, but it's nothing close to what's needed.
and the federal government's power to address every aspect of the pandemic is limited. Joel Zinberg is a physician and a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute.
Most of the direct actions are going to have to take place at the state and local level.
Even at the federal level, Biden will need Congress on board to fund proposals like doubling the number of drive-through testing sites and creating a public health job corps. Laura Blessing is a senior fellow at the Government Affairs Institute at Georgetown University.
The simple way of looking at this is that anything on Biden's list that requires funding requires Congress.
And who wields political control in that branch of government is still being sorted out. In Washington, I'm Kimberly Adams for Marketplace.
And just now, confirmation that S&P Global has reached a deal to buy IHS Markit, another business data firm, for a lot of money. The Wall Street Journal indicates perhaps $44 billion. I'm David Brancaccio. This is the Marketplace Morning Report. From APM, American Public Media.
WNYC supporters include Rothman Orthopedics. Their new Midtown office is accessible by multiple forms of transportation to all of Manhattan, now open at 645 Madison Avenue. Learn more at rothmanny.com.
COVID cases in New Jersey are spiking, and the primary cause is indoor socializing. That's left Governor Phil Murphy to plead with residents to stay home this holiday season.
It's up to us, folks. If it comes down to needing law
enforcement to be in your dining room in order to bend the curve that my guess is we've lost.
On the next Ask Governor Murphy, we'll take your calls on COVID, marijuana legalization, and his re-election campaign. Thursday night at 7 on WNYC.
This is WNYC, FM, HD, and AM, New York.
Good morning. Moderna says new data backs earlier findings that its COVID-19 vaccine is safe and effective. The company is asking for an emergency use authorization, which could come in just a few weeks. Meanwhile, frontline healthcare workers are battling exhaustion.
I keep telling my colleagues, like, when is somebody going to pinch me so that I can wake up from this nightmare?
I'm David First. It's Morning Edition from NPR and WNYC. The killing of a top nuclear scientist in Iran could shake relations with the U.S. and Israel. The NFL struggles amid rising infections. And after an earthquake, China and Nepal decided to remeasure Mount Everest. Now they're about to reveal the results. It's Monday, November 30th. The news is next.
Live from NPR News, I'm Corva Coleman. President-elect Joe Biden has named his incoming White House communications team. All 7 top staffers are women, led by Communications Director Kate Bedingfield and Press Secretary Jen Psaki. NPR's Mara Eliason says the team is filled with a diverse set of staffers that reflect groups critical to Biden's election victory.
Joe Biden, perhaps making a pointed contrast with Trump, has said that communicating truthfully is one of the president's most important duties. Presumably, these are the people who are going to be doing that. And compared to Trump, we may see more of them relatively less of Biden.
NPR's Mara Eliason. Biden will be wearing a walking boot for some weeks. He fractured his right foot while playing with his dog over the weekend. Biden's doctor says there are hairline fractures in 2 bones. Nearly 156,000 new cases of the coronavirus were reported on Sunday, according to Johns Hopkins University. There were nearly 1,200 deaths. Over the weekend, more than 91